Hello, good morning, good afternoon, even good evening. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our Data Values Community meeting today. We're very excited to have this discussion today focusing on pathways for accountable data governance. And we have an excellent lineup of speakers, and we're looking forward to hearing from all of you who've joined us. So it's evident that participation in data governance is essential to rebalancing power structures. People have the greatest understanding of their own challenges and experiences, and therefore they must be involved in how data about them or that affects them is designed, collected, funded, managed, and used. So this is why the Data Values Manifesto urges companies, civil society organizations, donors, governments, and others to invest in public participation for more accountable data governance. So today's Data Values community session will be one of many over the next year, which is intended to explore various topics that are covered in the Data Values Manifesto. We continue to encourage you all to join us and share your views. And we're also open to hearing from partners, those who'd like to take on and host one of these meetings and engage with the Data Values community. But before we get going and we focus on the agenda and the presentation and the speakers, we want to begin by understanding where all of you are at in terms of your own thinking and understanding on data governance. So please log into Slido using the image on the screen, the QR code, or by clicking the link in the chat, which should be added now, and complete the questions. So take a moment to share your views using Slido. And while you do that, I'm going to dive in a little bit just to run through the agenda and a few housekeeping items. Great. So we have a packed agenda. We're doing the welcome and introductions. I'll be doing a brief presentation on our thinking around accountable data governance, very much informed by the consultation on the Data Values Project and the engagement through the Data Values campaign. Then we're going to have a great panel discussion and a Q&A with panelists. And then we'll share at the very end some Data Values campaign opportunities and announcements. So on to the housekeeping items. We're all now very accustomed to Zoom, but as you all will have seen, the session will be recorded and then shared online. A live transcript is available for this session. You should see the button on your screen if you would like to turn this on. Please make sure that if you do speak, you speak a little bit more slowly to help everyone follow your comments. So please raise your hand if you'd like to come in. Keep your comments short and sweet. And please use the chat to communicate and share ideas and questions at any point in the discussion today. Okay, so now we're going to look at the poll responses. A reminder to everyone to just keep yourselves on mute if you're not speaking. So the first question, looking at our results, how familiar and confident are you with the topic of data governance? So we have an even split, more or less, between very familiar and somewhat familiar, and we have a brave soul who acknowledged that they have no idea, or one or two. I'm not quite sure whether 14% presents multiple people, and I see more people being brave. That is okay. That's no problem. We're here to talk about data governance today. We're here to hear from several panelists who've been doing a lot of thinking and work on data governance, and we hope that you're able to come away with some new thoughts and insights and form your own views. Great. So moving on, using one word. What is the first thing that comes to your mind when we speak about people's participation in data governance? I see our word cloud has words that are more or less similar sizes, so that's interesting. That tells us that lots of different words come to people's minds. Complex, citizens, good. We're going to have a real focus on engagement and privacy. Engagement and people. Then we see privacy on the screen, inclusion, control, stewardship, fair, bottom up, data for good, Emancipation, I like that one. We do spend a lot of time thinking about how data not only harms, but can empower and enable people to exercise their rights and achieve their own goals. So we'll move on to the third one now. Finally, in a few words, what are some mechanisms for making data governance more participatory? So let's see what we have here. Open and show data inventories, providing a toolbox, very interesting. So that's a lot about transparency, I think. Setting agreed standards for participation, allowing us to promote inclusive data. Compliance with laws, I think that's critical, very important. Oftentimes when people say data governance, the first thing we think of is laws, policies, and regulation. And that's essential, but in our view, not sufficient. Engaging all stakeholders and including everyone. So that's great. And that's a very nice segue into our presentation for today. So thank you all for sharing your views and inputs. It's really great to see what the feel of is in the Zoom room today. So we're going to start, and I'm going to do a quick presentation to share with you our latest thinking on accountable data governance. So let's move on to the next slide. So what is data governance and why does it matter? So despite a kind of increasing popularity of this term, or that we're hearing it more and more, not just in policy circles, but in common discussions, the term remains pretty unclear, and it definitely still means very different things to different people. At its origins, the term emerged from private sector practices for managing data, but in the last decade, it's evolved a lot to encompass the laws, policies, strategies, and decision-making in the management and use of data by a single organization or by multiple parties. So the term applies to a wide range of activities, from how small organizations use data on a daily basis to how international agreements treat data privacy and sharing. It also refers to how decisions are made and how organizations interact in the context of bilateral or multilateral data sharing, such as through data collaboratives or shared data platforms. Now, informed by our work on the Data Values Project and the Global Partnerships engagement with its network of over 700 partners, we've sort of zeroed in on a data governance definition as focusing on decision-making related to data with outcomes that impact the entire data value chain and the people involved in or affected by data use. So together with other organizations, some of which are present today, we focus our attention on the decision-making part of the definition rather than specific outcomes such as laws or internal policies. Now, there's an increasingly broad agreement that this decision-making process needs to be opened up and that people and communities need to be involved in decisions around data. But what we've come to sort of feel pretty strongly is that these conversations that acknowledge the value of bottom-up participation and engagement, they typically go no further than affirming that opening up these processes is important. But stopping there doesn't help us address some of the key challenges related to data and power. So notably, that's concerning the concentration of power and decision-making around data. And even when the people who have the most to gain or lose from decision-making around data are largely excluded. And secondly, that there's a real lack of practical recommendations and examples for how people trying to make decisions more transparent and accountable can actually do so. And that's why I'm so excited to hear from our panelists today. So we want to move the discussion further. We want to elucidate some of the practical ways that data can be made more accountable and more participatory. So moving on to the next slide, what do we really mean by accountable data governance? What do we mean by making governance more accountable? So we define accountable data governance as decision-making strategies, policies, and practices that are characterized by three things: participation, transparency, and sustainability. So in this context for us, participation means that mechanisms for individuals and communities to take part in decision-making are available and accessible. Transparency means that decision-making processes are visible, understandable, and that decision-making powers and rules are clear and explicit to all stakeholders, especially people and communities impacted by those decisions. And finally, for us, sustainability refers to the notion that ensuring transparency and citizen participation should not be a one-off. It should be a recurrent activity. Engagement and mechanisms for participation should be embedded in data governance practices and be consistently replicated over time. They should be integral parts of data governance approaches instead of occasional tokens. So the ideas contained in this definition came out very, very strongly in the consultation that eventually led to the Data Values White Paper and Manifesto. And it's also informed, like I said, by the work that the Global Partnership does at the country level, regional level, and national level with its diverse network of partners. Just this week, we published a paper delving into this idea of accountable data governance and highlighting where more work needs to be done to make data governance more accountable. So Fadumo is going to put the link to that paper in the chat so you can delve into these ideas that I'm presenting a little bit further. So let's just move on to the next slide. So just a few thoughts from that paper on the pathways for accountable data governance. So as I said, there are many facets of data governance, and the legal, regulatory, and institutional frameworks are essential. And there's no doubt about that. And there's some excellent work going on those frameworks around the world. However, it's not enough. They're not enough on their own to make data governance truly accountable. So based on our engagement, the first pathway that we really focus on is putting participation at the heart of data systems. This is about creating and maintaining dedicated spaces for participation and deliberation around data collection, sharing, and use. And our sense is that the demand for such spaces is rising, as proven by the popularity and engagement and burgeoning literature around data trust, data institutions, citizen assemblies, and data cooperatives and other mechanisms. But even when the demand is not clearly articulated, evidence suggests that creating those spaces for participation can have a really effective response in mobilizing the individuals and communities that were not previously engaged. Another really important note is that our views on participation are not necessarily about direct participation. We recognize that it's not realistic to give every person everywhere a role in decision-making on every data governance matter, nor is it feasible or desirable. But there are ways indirectly through representation, through various mechanisms to create avenues for that participation. And finally, the idea of data stewardship is a function or a role that has emerged in both private sector and public sector discussions. And it's clear that data stewards have a really critical role to play in creating these avenues and spaces for participation, bringing different stakeholders in and creating a mechanism to allow people who are affected by decision-making around data to be able to weigh in on those decisions. And the second pathway, it really focuses on strengthening leaders' capacity in data governance. And here, this is really critical because the emphasis on skills and capacity development in the data space has typically focused on technical skills and capacities, data science, the ability to use geospatial tools and technologies, programming languages, but much less attention has been given to the governance and management skills required to foster accountable data governance, to enable that participation and to build trust with various stakeholders. And our sense is that there's very little formal training out there on these matters. We've found very little, though some does exist, and that oftentimes because data governance is so context specific that creating avenues for mentorship and peer exchange is one of the most viable ways to build knowledge and understanding and skills on data governance, because it allows people in different scenarios to troubleshoot and share their experiences. So that's an area we'll be focusing on in the future. So with that, and you're very welcome to throw questions into the chat on anything that I've said in that presentation. We're going to move on now to our panelists, and we're happy to bring your questions in the Q&A. So we'll move on now to our panelists. We have a great set of people with us today. We have Shefali Girish, research analyst at AFDI Institute. We have Christophe Bouquet, who is associate partner at Dahlberg Data Insights. We have Sylvan Obedi, one of our data values advocates, and we have Jonathan Smith, advocacy and campaigns director from Connected by Data. So I'm going to ask our panelists a series of questions, asking them to keep their responses to just a few minutes. I have more than one question, so as always, you get more than one bite at the apple, and we'll be able to hear from you multiple times for sure. So we're going to start with Shefali today. Shefali, AFDI is working towards an equitable and just digital world where people can negotiate with technology. So how does people's participation in data governance play a role in this agenda and beyond for you? Over to you, Shefali.
Hi, Jenna. Thank you so much. So I think that the current data economy or the data practices limits the ability of individuals and communities to participate, because what we have is what we exercise choice through consent, and consent has its obvious problems, such as it's usually not informed, it's broken, it's not extensive enough, and you also have this issue of consent fatigue, where because of consent fatigue, it actively undermines users' abilities to make such informed decisions about their data. So to have a just and equitable digital economy or a world is to ensure that the societal collective social value of data is unlocked through meaningful participation, where communities exercise their data rights and according to their data priorities, and their interests and rights are safeguarded. So given the limitation of the current consent paradigm, there is a need to move away from this privacy model to a more accountable model. And by accountability, I basically mean that there should be an emphasis uh, on the data producers' ability to control the downstream uses of data and to hold data users liable, to hold them liable for their actions. So I think at AFDI, we have been exploring data stewardship as a paradigm of data governance that centers individuals and communities. So we started off with building a taxonomy report that delineates different types of data stewards. We built tools like the Stewardship Navigator to kind of provide stewarding entities with design choices as they build their stewards. And then we also recently came up with a playbook, which was exactly to foster participatory data governance, and what are the different strategies that different stakeholders in the ecosystem could play, from policymakers to tech developers to stewards themselves. So I think that the participatory data stewardship has a lot to learn from, or the ladder of citizen participation is a good like tool to diagnose where we are currently in terms of participation in our data governance, and also the different possibilities that data stewardship provides to enhance participation. For example, data cooperatives have a high level of participation because it's structured very similar to offline cooperatives. So which means that all members are provided with a set of voting rights where they could make granular or collective decisions about their data. So there are a couple of challenges. There are, I think, for stewards also to kind of define and deliver on the value of data in isolation without the consultation of communities becomes a really complex task. So I think the way forward is to identify, of course, like we need a change in the legal and regulatory framework to embed participation, but I think that there is a need to be aware of the varying values, incentives, bandwidth, interest, and capabilities of individuals and communities in participating in data collection and governance, and also to determine how involved they should be in the life cycle of data, from the data collection to the decision making, and of course like the ultimate deletion of data. So yeah, I think that's basically it.
Great, Shefali. Really great to hear you talk about the way in which that consent framework is insufficient and meaningful participation. I heard you mention data cooperatives, and we'll come back to you on that. So over to Christoph now. Through Dalberg Data Insights, you work on building inclusive data ecosystems to solve pressing global challenges. As a private sector company, why does Dalberg believe it is important to include people in data governance?
Thank you, Jenna, and hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you. And yeah, no, indeed, a great question. And as Dalberg being a social impact driven firm, basically first we do believe in the social impact potentials of making data governance more participatory. That is, I think, one of the key reasons why, of course, we have made the decisions to really invest in this sector. And there are different reasons due to that. I think you mentioned and you unpacked them already really well in your kind of introduction, Jenna. But I think another way to justify it is, at the end of the day, we see data governance, whether there be standards, policies, processes, or sometimes even solutions like some of the ones that Shefali just presented or introduced. We see them as solutions that require the contribution of individuals, but they're also designed essentially to serve individuals. And because of that, because of the fact that at the end of the day, data governance solutions are so much anchored on the individuals, we do believe that it's critical to really involve these individuals in the process of design, development, and building of these data governance solutions to make sure that they are fit for purpose. And so one of the key reasons, again, why Dalberg and Dalberg Data Insights, being our data science and digital transformation arm, really focuses on data governance in a participatory manner. It's really because we have a deep belief in the social impact potential of driving data governance in a participatory manner. But then, of course, there are, I guess, other reasons, and I would like to maybe mention two, that lead us to, as a private company, to really invest in that sector. The other one is just very simply that we are very enthusiastic also to see that in the ecosystem that we serve, with the stakeholders that we tend to work with, whether they are partners or clients, we also see a very expressed need to build data governance this way. I think that, again, our ecosystem has really realized the importance of investing in this participatory approach to make the data governance impactful and sustainable and scalable also in these organizations. And so naturally, we are really happy to follow that trend as well, and to go with these stakeholders who are already expressing the need for it. And then I just would like to close this by saying that one of the reasons also why Dalberg as a private company is investing in this is that we believe that we are fairly uniquely positioned to do it. And this is thanks to the fact that as a firm, we have also built intentionally a set of capabilities that is really diverse. And maybe in this very context, I would like to, again, mention the fact that we are used to join forces with our teams of data scientists, data engineers, but then also with our teams of human-centered designers, who are really individuals that are purely focusing on making sure that the solutions that we build, and in this case, let's talk about data governance solutions, are really involving the people who down the road will be impacted by the data governance, but also who will be basically involved in making data governance a success. So these are some quick reactions to this.
Great, thank you, Christoph. I like that point about requiring the contribution of individuals, but also that data governance be designed to serve those individuals. So, so sort of both pieces of the puzzle there. Now we're going to move over to Sylvain. Sylvain is a member of our data values cohort. And for you, Sylvain, why do you think it's critical that everyone's thoughts, experiences, and input are considered when it comes to decision-making related to data and data practices?
Thank you so much for the speech which you've given me. So as a data value advocate, I mean, the data is really essential. That's to include thinking and all speech from each one from the community, because decision makers is really affected with data issue, and it's important to include everyone, because for each day or for every day, data is usually affects our lives, and it may affect our lives positively or negatively. And in each places for young or for person with disability, data usually affects, unfortunately, negatively. It means they still missing in data, and also that's they are excluded in some of a program, which may be humanitarian program or a program which may be aimed by the government, because of the missing of that data. And I mean, it's the data it has also the power, and the power which someone who is accessing to data, which is included from the collecting of data until the using of data, he has that power to be represented in the data, and it's really very important. It means all data that is really affecting our lives for each kind of activity which we are doing, and once we still not being represented in data, we still know being taking our special needs in account, and that is really not good, and this might change. And for the another money, it's as now advocacy, data advocate, and also person with disability, and myself leading an organization of persons with disability. For people with disability, for now, we really have a very interested on data, because we have understood that is really very important. And for that, for now, there is a many movement of persons with disability and organization of persons with disability who are now demanding or asking the manifold engagement and participation in all the processes of data, from the collection to analysis and to the decision makers, because this will be now to assure that no one who is leaving behind. Yeah, that is. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sylvain, and for sharing that experience you have working with disability rights activists and your organization working with persons with disabilities. I think that relationship between sort of representation and being engaged and ensuring that those views are heard is so essential. And you did a great job answering both of my questions. So we're going to now come to Jonathan, which is a kind of a nice link up with where Shefali started us on some of the problems with the individual consent frameworks that we have today. At Connected by Data, Jonathan, we'd love to hear how you all are thinking about the collective dimensions of data governance beyond those individual dimensions. So over to you, Jonathan.
Well, Ms. Jen, hi, everybody. Yeah, it was great to hear what everybody said. I think, I mean, just interestingly, you were talking about who's involved in data governance, and I'm not a data person. I come from very much from a social justice campaigning and community organising background, and so it's interesting. I'm one of those people who sort of recently come across into this world, which is to think about power and how data works, and I think that's very much where Connected by Data coming from, and I think it really starts by seeing data as something that is embedded in the system of power, and thinking about how data-driven systems are also increasingly ubiquitous under all our lives, almost wherever you are in the world, with smartphones, whether it's dating, whether it's traffic management, whether it's what you buy online, whether it's the price you get, whether the government service you have. This sense of very powerful systems that are ubiquitous in our lives, and how do we address those? And I think it's also the sense that you can't really separate the data from the decisions that are made with that data, and that's a really important point about data governance as well. It's not just this idea of, and I think this is where it challenges some of the privacy thinking for a number of reasons. One is that it's not just about the data; it's the impact of the data. It's the thought those impacts of that data, those data systems, goes much broader than the individual, and that because of that, we need to look at collective responses and how we build power around these collective things. I'll go into a bit more detail into that if you think about it, because if you think about how decisions with data are made, and we obviously start with individual privacy, which is really important, but most decisions about data made today are not just made with our own personal data, they're made with other people's data. They're made by how data is looked at, set, organised, ranked, collected. So it absolutely has a sort of collective dimension. And also the impacts of that data use have a collective dimension, whether that's about land use, whether it's about traffic management, or whether actually it's in work about how your performance is ranked, the prices you get paid as a gig worker. That's all comparing other people's data as well as your own data and non-personal data. So we're saying we really feel we need to move, it's not to reject individual rights and privacy, but to move on it and think about how do we think about collective data governance to sort of allow individuals and communities to have power, which is very much where Connected by Data is coming from. And I guess that's really important, because there's a few things about it as well. Well, our experience of the decisions that are driven by data often as atomized individuals, we don't get a sense of how it's affecting other people. So we may be in a group where that data decision is affecting a lot of people, but we very much experience it on our own. But how do we get people to share and understand the collective nature of that? I think there's a really strong thing about how do we then organize people, come together to ask questions about how those collective decisions are being made, and build the power, build those groups, those civil society organisations, those trade unions, to actually have insight into data, use that knowledge of data to win rights and power. So that's the sort of thing we're really looking at. And we're very much, I think, it's building on the principles that you were talking about in your sort of early presentation about it's really important that people know about the data held about them, communities know, and the sort of processes that are revealed, because a lot of it is very technical and very hidden. Very important that people have a say once they know, and they have a say not just in their individual impact, but the collective impacts. And it's also really important that those tools for redress and accountability are absolutely there. And the sort of things we're looking at therefore in Connected by Data are looking at good practice and participatory decision making, and which goes from not just people having a say, but what's the accountability about that? What happens with that? How does it move into regulation? Building power among communities to look at data and challenge that and shift policy, and also beginning to change the stories. And one of the big things we're doing is looking at how we put humans in the loop. So we've been doing some really interesting work about gig workers, and we're also working a lot on legislation in the UK at the moment around data. I think I've probably said enough.
That's great. Thank you, Jonathan. So many really interesting ideas to kind of unpick there. You also did a great job on moving into some of my second questions, but you created a nice segue for us to come back to Shefali, I think, because you asked this question of how do we organize people to sort of ask questions and be engaged. And Opti Institute has done some really interesting work on data cooperatives, which is one mechanism. So Shefali, I'd like to turn to you to tell us a little bit about how data cooperatives work and how they can contribute to making data governance more accountable. And just as we, are coming more than halfway through our session today, ask you to sort of keep it to about 3 minutes, please, if you can. Over to you, Shefali.
Yeah, so I think cooperatives serve as the ideal form of existing community-oriented institutions to facilitate data stewardship. And the reason I think that is because the principles that ground the cooperative movement, which is being non-monopolistic, having one member, one vote, focusing on collective benefits, etc., they serve as a promising alternative to the kind of extractive data practices that are in place now. So this makes data cooperative an ideal steward. Also, to kind of build a data layer on existing cooperatives becomes much more easier. And at Aapti, we've been thinking about gender data cooperatives mostly because a lot of principles of cooperatives also include supporting the communities that they work with in terms of education and training initiatives, which are extremely important for women as it provides them access to social protection. So we have been working with a use case, which is Megha. So Megha Mandli is a women farmer cooperative in Gujarat, and they're an agricultural cooperative, and the cooperative mainly works on the input side, which is that they focus on activities such as supplying the paddy seeds or the poultry the poultry feed, for instance, but they don't work on the output. So the farmers just sell their output by themselves because there is a lack of funds. And this is particularly true because they're also women farmers, because being women farmers, you not only lack a voice in decision making, you also lack a lot of access to opportunities. So the problems faced by the farmer community is much more disproportionate for women, because at least in India, in terms of their right to land, in terms of access to input, market, credit, etc. So our hypothesis was that if you add a data layer and pool alternative data to demonstrate credit worthiness, then you can give access to credit by by demonstrating credit worthiness to digital financial service providers who use AIs and who use alternative data to provide credit. So like from our experience with the field visits that we've conducted, so we're planning to co-design a data cooperative blueprint almost. So in this process, we realized that members usually respond or they are interested in this when they see there's value, when there is trust, and when we are very transparent about the purpose for which this data cooperative would be set up. And the reason why data cooperatives are accountable and a much more better form of data governance is that they, with Megha at least, apart from providing values such as access to credit, securely managing, storing, and sharing data, it empowers women farmers to take control of their data and helps them decide how data is used. And also, it also enhances digital trust because data cooperatives can ensure that there is training and awareness on how to use these digital products, and also it can ensure that AI systems are not exploitative. It can ensure that there's a grievance redressal system in place. It can probably evaluate social consequences of such data use. So which is why we think that building a data layer on existing cooperative structures could be immensely helpful, especially for women. So that's the work that we're largely doing, which is understanding and exploring and testing out gender data cooperatives as a viable model.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
And now.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I had a momentary fail on my earphones. Apologies. Well, thanks, Shefali. That was really great. I want to turn now just over to you, Christoph, to come in with sharing a few approaches that Dalberg is using to create a human-centered approach when it comes to data governance, please.
Sure. Thank you, Jenna. And I guess it would be interesting, or if we have a bit of time, I would be curious to see if Shefali kind of resonates with maybe the approach that I will present or introduce to, because I wouldn't be surprised that they have used similar approaches to build the female farmer data cooperative that she just touched upon. But one way to try to summarize the approach that we follow at Dalberg to build data governance in a participatory manner is to introduce a human-centered design approach. And maybe if I can just summarize this process in 3 steps. We usually basically start by understanding the users, the beneficiaries, and the contributors to the data governance solutions that we are looking at. And this is, again, really looking at the broader spectrum of stakeholders and individuals that will eventually be impacted by the data governance solutions that we are aiming at putting in place, but also looking at the stakeholders that will have to contribute to the data governance solution to make them live and to make sure that they are deployable, basically. And so that's the first point, really looking at these, let's say, users. And then we go from that point to the mapping of the use cases. And the use cases is really built on that understanding of the challenges, the pain points, but also the opportunities and some of the incentives that are basically animating the contributors and beneficiaries of the data governance. And in that phase, we really try to understand from a very actionability perspective how the data governance can actually support these stakeholders to achieve a particular goal. And so it's very much a bottom-up approach where we don't start from big principles of data governance, or we don't especially start from the definitions of the policies and the standards, but we really start from, let's say, the more downstream part of the data value chain, where there is actual usage and integration of data insights into decision-making processes. And so that's the second step that is really looking at the use cases after having looked at the users. And then the third step is really the one that is at the core of the design, the development, and the deployment of these data governance solutions that we have been discussing so far, whether they are whether we are talking about policies, about standards, or about actual structures and organizational structures, such as the female farmer data cooperative that Shefali was presenting before. And then maybe just I would like to close this by also underlying the fact that beyond this kind of 3-step approach where we look at the users, the use cases, and then the actual design and building of the governance solution, we also tend to do it in a very co-creation manner, meaning that we involve both the organizations that we are working with and working for, who is aiming at building that data governance, but we also involve the people who will down the road be impacted by that data governance, as well as the people who will have to contribute to make it real. And this co-creation can take many different forms, but in the best case scenario, this can actually turn into several days of workshop where we co-create with these different actors to really make sure that we deeply understand, again, their needs, their challenges, but also some of the opportunities that are very individual specific. And so that's just the way, in a nutshell, that Dalberg as an organization is aiming at building data governance in a participatory manner with a human-centered design approach.
Thank you so much, Christoph. And I want to make sure that our audience here has a chance to come in with any questions. So we have seen a few contributions in the chat. One question asking about good examples of legal or justice data that folks know of. So that's one. But I wonder if anyone else would either like to come off mute and ask a question, or just probably put a question into the chat for our panelists. I can always jump in with more questions, but I want to make sure that folks on the line have an opportunity to ask questions. So anyone, you're welcome. In the meantime, seeing none for now, I'd like to come back to Jonathan and Sylvain and maybe ask you both to share with us one example. In Sylvain's case, one example of how your organization, working with persons with disabilities, has really engaged with this question of data governance and what has been the effect of that? And Jonathan, what is one really sort of concrete action that you're taking at Connected by Data to answer some of the questions you posed in your previous comments around organizing communities or helping people understand that collective dimension and how and why to engage? So one example from each of you, bearing in mind we are coming up, we have 10 minutes left in the session, but so asking you to keep your remarks to 2 minutes. Maybe we'll go to Jonathan first, and then I'll come to Sylvain.
Yeah, by all means. I think one of the really interesting examples is a very UK example, so I hope that's okay in a global context. Is some of the work we've been doing. There's quite a big legislative change happening in the UK at the moment around data protection law, which is moving away from the European regulation, GDPR, for anybody who's into this sort of thing, to sort of what's seen as a more sort of British data protection law. And we've been doing a lot of campaigning around that, particularly actually working with some of the trade unions in the UK, because we have been seeing, I think there's a much more of a sort of deregulatory approach by the present government in the UK, which is taking away various sort of really important, what we think are really important data rights around what are called subject access requests, where particularly workers can ask about what data is held and why. The removal for what are called data protection impact assessments, again, technical words, but that's about assessing what the impact of the data use will be, the removal of some of the human in the loop decision-making around automated decision-making. And we're very much sort of doing some organising and working with those unions to build a campaign that is basically saying there's a lot of evidence in other countries where you get unions and employers working together, and you build trust around that data use. You have participation by unions and workers' bodies in that. You get much better impacts. You get much better adoption of technology, and you get better productivity. Where you don't that, you actually see tension and the sort of stuff I think globally that's been raised around employees for Facebook or Amazon or a range of people. So it's one of the examples of where we're taking a sort of the sort of abstract and turning it into some campaigning and thinking about sort of collective action in that. Hopefully that's useful.
Yeah, that's absolutely great, Jonathan. And, you know, the reason I posed the question, building on the examples that Shefali and Christoph already shared, is that it's easy to say participation is a good. It's easy to say that we want to open up data governance. It's a lot harder to figure out how to do that. And so we're really eager to get down to those crunchy examples. And that's really great.
I think it's also really interesting to ask about who has the power and how does that participation work within those power relations. And that's always a really key organising question I think we think about.
Absolutely, absolutely. So that's actually a great segue to Sylvain. In your work with persons with disabilities, can you give us an example of that engagement around data, what effect it's had, and maybe reflecting a little bit on Jonathan's point about shifting that balance of power? So over to you.
Thank you so much. So the example of engagement about organization with disability, which we are doing. So firstly, data for people with disability, even for general everyone, that is unknown. This is like something which is this is a new, but even if people are using data everywhere, but they don't know how they can advocate to ask for being more representative in data, or to ask even all data which they are been asking for, what it is doing, what is the useful of that data which they usually give when they usually do registration, when they I don't know, they usually go to hospital. People are only giving the information, but are not asking why. But for people with disability, they don't even know. Even people are not even access to that possibility of being taking their data. And what we are doing as movement of persons with disability or organization, firstly, we are training people with disability to know what is the data and how they can advocate for inclusive data. And then after that training, when they understand what is the data and how they can proceed to advocate for inclusive data, we usually now do advocacy to ask for accountability for the public authority. It means the Office of Statistics, we usually ask now for them to be representative in data. And what has just been done since this movement have begun from, I don't know, New York or around the world, there is many organizations who are working on this to have a data accessible or data inclusivity. And with the consortium of IDA, International Disability Alliance, CBM, they had worked on material, which is helping all organizations of persons with disability on how they can train on data and how they can advocate for data based on evidence. It means, firstly, they have to have capacity, the capacity building, and after that, they can now advocate to the public authority, to the Office of Statistics, to be representative in data. That is the work which we are doing. And after that, all organizations which I will say was they write a tool which help people with disability to advocate on data. That tool usually help people to prepare some message to give in the community about data advocacy, which is focusing on disability data and how we can work with humanitarian to know how they can also have a response which is accessible for people with disability. That is some example which we are doing, and even in practice, like with this Data Valley project in my work of Data Valley advocates, I'm preparing a training which will aim people with disability, 7 organizations with disability from local level here, who will be training on how to advocate on data, and they will build a network which will be now having that voice at a national level, regional level, to see how people with disability can be representative in data. And that training will be coming next month. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sylvain. That is really great and super interesting. We have just a few minutes left. And so I'm going to just share with everyone what we have coming up and what the opportunities are to engage more in the Data Values campaign. I want to also just thank our panelists. As I already said, it's such a pleasure to hear your insights and particularly the concrete ways in which you're really digging into this rather complex question. I understand that the audience was a little quiet today, and I think that's because it's a difficult concept. These are difficult concepts to get our head around, but you all gave us so many really concrete ideas and practical ideas for how to think about making data governance more accountable, and the actual steps that you're taking to do so. And Sylvain, we're looking forward to your project as a data values advocate, along with that of the 6 others in the cohort. So we have a few campaign opportunities and announcement coming up. These meetings take place every 2 months. And so we'll have the next one in July. So if you have any topics or ideas that you want to share with us, don't hesitate to get in touch. As the Data Values Campaign and the Global Partnership will be present at RightsCon in Costa Rica, where we have a couple of sessions, and we'll be engaging with the community there. Please reach out to us if you plan to be there. Second, we'll be revamping the social media toolkit for the campaign, always wanting to keep things fresh. So look out for that, and remember that you're welcome to use the collateral for the Data Values Campaign. It's open and available to everyone as part of the movement. And soon we'll be announcing the Data Values Grassroots Grantees. So we'll be making a series of small grants to grassroots organizations to help them advance the data values agenda with their own constituencies and in their own areas. So thank you so much for joining us today. Fidumo is going to launch a very quick poll. It will take not more than 30 seconds for you to complete. It's always important for us to be data-driven and get your input. Please do complete it. Thank you again to our panelists today, and thank you for joining us. And we very much look forward to the next one. Don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have any ideas or thoughts you want to share. So thank you all, and have a lovely rest of your day, afternoon, and evening. Thank you. Bye-bye.